You've seen the posts. You've heard the arguments. We are not African. We are the original indigenous people of America. And maybe you believed it. Maybe you rejected it. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle, genuinely unsure. Today, we are going to settle this, not with opinions, not with social media claims, but with DNA evidence, historical records, and documented facts. By the end of this video, you will have a straight answer. Here is what makes this question different from most. There is not one answer. There are actually three, and which one applies to you depends entirely on who your ancestors were and what kind of indigeneity we are talking about. Some Black Americans have no indigenous connection whatsoever. Some have a partial one, and a small number have a connection that is documented, legal, and being fought over in courts right now. We're going to cover all three. Before we go any further, let's be clear about what this video is and what it is not. This is not an attack on Black identity. This is not a dismissal of Black history. This is the most honest, thorough breakdown of this question that exists on YouTube. We are going to go places most creators are too afraid to go, because you deserve real answers. Not comfort, not hype, not politics. Just the truth, backed by evidence. Before we can answer whether Black Americans are indigenous, we have to define what indigenous actually means. Because here is the problem. Most of the arguments you see online are people using the same word but meaning completely different things. One person means it legally, another means it ancestrally, and they are talking past each other, generating heat but zero light. So let us fix that right now, once and for all. There are two completely separate definitions of indigenous, and both are valid. The first is legal indigeneity. This means you are officially recognized by a federally acknowledged tribe, by the government, by documented enrollment. This comes with real consequences: land rights, treaty benefits, tribal sovereignty, legal protections. This is not about feelings or family stories. This is paperwork, bloodlines on official rolls, and sovereign nations making binding decisions about who belongs. The second definition is ancestral or heritage indigeneity. This means your biological lineage or cultural history connects you to people who lived on this land before European colonization. No government needs to approve this. No enrollment card is required. This is about where your people came from, who they were, and what happened to them. It is personal, it is historical, and it is just as real, even if it carries no legal weight in a courtroom or a tribal office. Here is why this distinction matters so much for this video. A person can have ancestral indigeneity without legal indigeneity. They can have documented native ancestry, but still be denied tribal membership because of how tribes set their own enrollment rules. And on the other side, someone can be legally enrolled and recognized without looking the way people expect a Native American to look. Both situations exist. Both are common, and both are part of this story. So when you ask yourself, am I indigenous? You are actually asking two separate questions. First, do I have ancestors who were on this land before Europeans arrived? Second, does any legal body recognize that connection today? You might answer yes to one and no to the other. You might answer yes to both. The goal of this video is to give you enough information to answer both questions honestly for yourself, about your own family and history. Now that we know what indigenous means, we need to set up the rest of this video properly, because Black Americans and indigeneity is not one story. It is actually two completely separate stories running alongside each other, and confusing them is exactly why this debate never gets resolved. The first story is about most modern Black Americans, where they actually came from, what the DNA says, and how some indigenous ancestry entered their bloodlines. The second story is older and deeper. The second story is about black-skinned people who were already on this land before the slave trade even began. Before Columbus, before the first slave ship, there were dark-skinned people on this continent whose descendants may still be here today, reclassified, renamed, and absorbed into what we now call Black America. That is a completely different pathway to indigeneity, and it deserves its own serious examination. Both stories are real. Both matter. Here is the important thing to understand as we go through these two stories. They are not mutually exclusive. A single Black American family could have ancestry that touches both pathways simultaneously. Ancestors brought from Africa on slave ships who then intermarried with indigenous people already here, some of whom may themselves have had connections to even earlier African contact. History does not move in straight lines. People mixed, borders moved, categories changed. We have to hold all of that complexity at once. We are going to walk through the first story first, about the DNA, the slave trade, the European ancestry, and the small but real Native American percentage that shows up in Black American genomes. Then we move to the second story, the pre-Columbian African presence, the dark-skinned tribes that disappeared from the historical record, and what the evidence actually says. By the time we finish both stories, the full picture will be clear. Let us start with the most important piece of evidence in this entire conversation: the DNA. When Black Americans take ancestry tests, the average result looks something like this. Roughly 73% sub-Saharan African, roughly 24% European, and only about 0.7% Native American. These numbers come from research by geneticists at 23andMe and were highlighted by Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. in his groundbreaking work on Black American ancestry. That 0.7% Native American is a critical number. It is not zero, meaning some Native ancestry does exist in the average Black American genome, but it is also not significant enough to support the claim that Black Americans are primarily or originally indigenous to this land. Henry Louis Gates calculated that if this Native American DNA came from a single ancestor, that ancestor lived approximately 10 generations back, which puts them around the year 1714. Very early in American colonial history. Now here is where it gets interesting. When Gates revealed these findings on national television, the reaction from Black Americans was volcanic. Families who had believed for generations that they had significant Cherokee or Native ancestry were confronted with science that told a different story. People were angry. Some rejected the tests entirely. And that reaction tells us something important. The belief in Native ancestry runs incredibly deep in Black American family culture, far deeper than the actual DNA supports. But before we close the book on that 24% European ancestry, we need to ask a question that almost nobody asks. Where did it come from? Because that number does not just appear out of nowhere. 24% European DNA in a population that was enslaved, isolated, and legally prevented from marrying white people for centuries. That requires an explanation. And the explanation matters enormously for understanding Black American history and identity. The most documented answer is sexual exploitation during slavery. Enslaved Black women had no legal protection under American law. Rape was not a crime when the victim was enslaved property. Slaveholders and overseers fathered children with enslaved women routinely, and those children were still classified as enslaved and Black regardless of their father's race. This is the primary mechanism through which European DNA entered Black American bloodlines. Not romance, not choice, but systematic violence and total legal vulnerability. Some European ancestry also entered through voluntary intermarriage, particularly in the period after emancipation and in specific communities. Free Black communities in the North, certain Louisiana Creole populations, and mixed-race frontier communities where racial boundaries were less rigidly enforced. These cases existed and contributed to the genetic picture, but they were far less common than exploitation during slavery. And we should be honest about that proportion, rather than softening the history. Now, here is something that will genuinely surprise most viewers, and it is scientifically important. Africa has the most genetically diverse human populations on the entire planet. This is not a controversial claim. It is established science. Human beings originated in Africa and spent hundreds of thousands of years there before migrating elsewhere. Every non-African population is essentially a genetic subset of African genetic diversity. What this means practically is that some genetic markers that ancestry companies flag as European actually originated in African populations first. This means that an African person who has never had a single European ancestor in their family tree can still carry genetic markers that an ancestry algorithm reads as European. The testing companies are comparing your DNA to reference populations of people alive today, not to ancient populations. And those reference populations are imperfect. So some portion of that 24% European in the average Black American genome may not represent European ancestry at all. It may represent ancient African genetic diversity that overlaps with what Europeans carry. This is a genuine scientific caveat that the testing companies themselves acknowledge. So, what does this all mean? Most modern Black Americans descend primarily from Africans who were brought to this continent by force between the 1600s and 1800s. Their DNA confirms this. The small Native American percentage that exists entered their bloodlines mostly through early colonial era contact in specific communities, not broadly across the population. And the European DNA that makes up nearly a quarter of their genome came primarily through the violence of slavery, with a secondary contribution from intermarriage and the complexity of African genetic diversity itself. This does not diminish Black American identity. It does not sever Black Americans from this land. It simply tells us that for most Black Americans, the pathway to any indigenous connection runs not through their primary African ancestry, but through specific historical circumstances we are about to examine in detail. The dark-skinned tribes that were erased, the freedmen who intermarried with native nations, and the people who were here long before any of this began. Here is a question that almost nobody thinks to ask. If Native Americans were the original inhabitants of this land, and they lived here for thousands of years, where are they now? The standard answer is disease, war, and forced relocation. And that is true. But there is another part of the answer that history books almost never include. Some of those indigenous people did not disappear. They were simply reclassified on paper by government officials with a pen and an agenda. To understand how this happened, you need to understand how racial classification worked in colonial and early American society. The government needed to sort people into categories: white, Indian, Negro, colored. And when a person had dark skin, the default classification was almost always Negro or colored, regardless of their actual tribal membership or ancestry. Skin color became more powerful than bloodline, more powerful than language, more powerful than the fact that a person had lived on tribal land their entire life and their parents had too. The Yamasee are one of the most important examples of this erasure. The Yamasee were a dark-complexioned indigenous people who lived across South Carolina and surrounding regions in the 1500s and 1600s. They were documented. They were known. But by the 1800s, official records began absorbing them into other categories. An 1836 U.S. military report noted that the remarkably dark-complexioned Yamasee had been absorbed into the Seminole nations. By 1894, the U.S. Census Print Office acknowledged their past presence, speaking of them as if they no longer existed as a distinct people. But here is the thing. They did not simply vanish into thin air. Populations do not do that. What happened is that their descendants continued living, continued having children, continued building communities. But those descendants, because of their dark complexion, were being recorded on government documents, not as Yamasee or Seminole or any native designation, but as Negro, as colored, as black. The tribe disappeared from the records while the people themselves kept living. That is what paper genocide looks like in practice. The Seminole Nation is another deeply important example. The Seminole people of Florida had a long and documented history of accepting runaway enslaved Africans into their communities. These Africans were not simply sheltered. They were integrated. They married into Seminole families. They fought alongside Seminole warriors in 3 separate Seminole wars against the United States government. Their children were born into Seminole culture, spoke Seminole languages, and lived on Seminole land. By every meaningful definition of community membership, they belonged. But when it came time for the government to categorize these people, the mixed Seminole and African communities, the racial logic of the era took over. Dark skin meant black, and black meant not Indian. Children who were half Seminole by blood, raised entirely within Seminole culture, were classified as Negro rather than Native. Their indigenous identity was not taken from them in battle. It was taken from them in a census office by a bureaucrat applying a racial rule that had nothing to do with actual ancestry or cultural belonging. This pattern repeated itself across the American South and Southeast. The Lumbee people of North Carolina, the Melungeon communities of Appalachia, the Red Bones of Louisiana. These were communities of mixed Native, African, and sometimes European ancestry who existed in the spaces between official racial categories. Depending on which government official was doing the classifying, and depending on how dark the community's complexion ran, they might be recorded as Indian one decade and colored the next. Their identity shifted not because they changed, but because the paperwork changed. Now, think about what this means for the DNA statistics we discussed in the previous segment. When we say the average Black American has only 0.7% Native American ancestry, we are measuring DNA against a population that was itself defined by racial classification systems. Some of the people counted as Black Americans in the genetic reference populations may actually be descendants of dark-skinned tribes who were reclassified. Their indigenous DNA is in the Black American gene pool, but it is being counted as Black, not Native, because that is how their ancestors were recorded. The 2020 census gave us a startling data point that supports this hidden population theory. The Census Bureau had predicted that about 1.7% of the American population would identify as having Native American ancestry. The actual result came back at 2.9%, nearly 4 million more people than projected suddenly reporting indigenous identity. Where did they come from? They did not appear from nowhere. They were always there. They were simply, for generations, being recorded as something else because the system was built to see dark skin and write down one word, Black. The honest, historical conclusion here is uncomfortable but important. The story of indigenous America is not as racially clean as popular culture presents it. There were dark-skinned indigenous people on this land. Some of them were absorbed into tribes like the Seminole. Some were reclassified out of Native identity entirely by colonial and American bureaucratic systems. Their descendants are almost certainly living today as Black Americans, carrying indigenous ancestry that was administratively stripped from their family records before their grandparents were even born. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history. To understand the Freedmen story, you need to understand something that most Americans, Black and white, were never taught in school. Native American tribes were not simply victims of the slave trade. Some of them were active participants in it. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, owned enslaved Black people on their own land, operated plantation-style economies, and in some cases fought on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War, specifically to protect that institution. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a documented one. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished across the United States, the federal government forced the 5 civilized tribes to sign new treaties. These treaties required the tribes to emancipate their enslaved Black people and, critically, to grant those freed people full citizenship within their tribal nations. The formerly enslaved Black people living within these tribes were given a name in the official records. They were called Freedmen, and their enrollment was recorded on the Dawes Rolls. The Dawes Rolls are one of the most important documents in this entire conversation. Created between 1898 and 1914, they are the official enrollment records of the 5 civilized tribes. Every person who was a recognized member of those nations was listed with either as a tribal citizen by blood or as a freedman. These are not family stories but oral traditions. These are federal government records held by the National Archives. If your ancestor is on the Dawes Rolls as a freedman, that is documented, legal, verifiable proof of your connection to one of those 5 tribal nations. Now, here is where the story gets both more complex and more painful. The freedmen who were enrolled after emancipation did not simply live alongside tribal members and then leave. Many of them stayed. Many of them intermarried with tribal citizens over the following generations. Children were born with both African and Native ancestry, running through their bloodline simultaneously. Children who were members of tribal nations by law, by culture, by community, and by blood. These were not people claiming Native ancestry based on a grandmother's story. These were people with papers. But in 1983, the Cherokee Nation amended its constitution and removed citizenship rights from freedmen descendants, people whose ancestors had been legally enrolled tribal citizens for nearly a century. The Creek Nation followed a similar path. The official justification was that freedmen were not tribal members by blood. They were enrolled as formerly enslaved people, not as biological Cherokee or Creek. But critics pointed out the obvious. After generations of intermarriage, many freedmen descendants did have native blood. And the timing of the expulsions coincided suspiciously with growing tribal casino revenues and federal benefits tied to enrollment numbers. As always, as soon as there is money to be shared, the real character becomes out. Freedmen were told they were no longer natives. The legal battle that followed was long, expensive, and brutal. Freedmen descendants went to federal courts, arguing that the post-Civil War treaties guaranteed their citizenship permanently and that the tribes could not unilaterally revoke it. In 2017, a federal court ruled in favor of Cherokee freedmen descendants, ordering the Cherokee Nation to restore their citizenship. It was a landmark decision. But the fight was not over. Other tribes continued their own versions of this battle, and the broader question of who gets to be Native American remained bitterly contested across Indian country. The book, We Refuse to Forget, documents the Creek Nation freedmen story in particular, and it is one of the most important pieces of research on this subject. It follows black members of the Creek Nation from the 1800s through the 20th century, people who fought in tribal wars, built tribal communities, raised families on tribal land, and were then told by the very nation their ancestors had belonged to that they were no longer welcome. The erasure was not ancient history. It was happening within living memory of people who are still alive today. What does this mean for a Black American watching this video right now? It means that if your family has roots in Oklahoma, in the old Indian Territory, or in communities connected to any of the 5 civilized tribes, there is a real possibility that your ancestry includes legitimate tribal enrollment. Not because of high cheekbones or family legend, but because your great-great-grandparent may be listed by name on a federal document that has been sitting in the National Archives for over 100 years. That document is searchable. That connection is verifiable. The Dawes Rolls are publicly accessible through the National Archives website. You can search them by name. If you find an ancestor listed as a freedman of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, or Seminole Nation, you have found documented evidence of a legal indigenous connection. Whether the tribe currently honors that connection depends on which nation you are dealing with and what the courts have most recently decided. But the ancestry itself, the historical fact of it, cannot be erased regardless of what any tribal constitution says today. The Freedmen story is perhaps the most concrete and most verifiable piece of this entire puzzle. It is the place where the answer to, are Black Americans indigenous, moves from historical argument to legal documentation. Some Black Americans are not just ancestrally connected to native nations. They are descended from people who were legally enrolled members of those nations, whose citizenship was stolen from them, not by colonizers, but by the very tribes their ancestors helped build. That is a specific, documented, undeniable injustice, and it deserves to be named exactly as what it is. Now we move to the oldest and most debated part of this entire conversation, and we need to be clear about something before we begin. This segment is not about the slave trade. It is not about freedmen. It is not about DNA percentages in modern Black Americans. This is about a completely separate question. Were there dark-skinned African people on this continent before Christopher Columbus ever set foot on a single Caribbean island in 1492? And what does the evidence actually say? The most important scholarly work on this subject is a book called They Came Before Columbus, written by historian Ivan Van Sertima and published in 1976. Van Sertima was not a fringe writer or a conspiracy theorist. He was a professor at Rutgers University and a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. His argument was built on multiple independent lines of evidence, not one single claim, but a convergence of archaeological, botanical, linguistic, and historical data, all pointing in the same direction. Van Sertima's evidence starts with the Olmec civilization, one of the earliest and most powerful civilizations in ancient Mesoamerica, flourishing in what is now Mexico from roughly 1500 BCE. The Olmecs left behind massive stone heads, some of them 10 feet tall and weighing 20 tons, with facial features that Van Sertima and others argue are distinctly African. Wide noses, full lips, strong jaw structures. These are not subtle resemblances. They are striking enough that serious archaeologists have been debating their significance for decades without reaching a final consensus. Beyond the stone heads, Van Sertima documented evidence of African plant species appearing in the Americas before Columbus. Cotton, bottle gourds, certain varieties of banana. These are plants that do not travel across oceans by accident. They require human transportation. He also documented the Mali expeditions. In 1310, the Emperor of Mali launched a fleet of 2,000 boats into the Atlantic Ocean. Only one returned. The expedition that did not return. Where did those boats go? Van Sertima argued the most logical answer is that at least some of them reached the Americas. The Mali expedition is not a legend or a myth. It is recorded in historical accounts by Arab scholar Al-Umari, who documented the story as told to him by Mansa Musa, the richest man in recorded human history, when Mansa Musa passed through Cairo in 1324 on his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa explicitly described how his predecessor had launched the Atlantic expedition. This is a primary historical source. It is not African American social media. It is a 14th century Arab document about a 14th century African king. Now, what happened to any Africans who may have arrived in the Americas before Columbus? This is where honest scholarship has to acknowledge its limitations. We do not have a complete answer. What we do know is that pre-Columbian America was home to hundreds of distinct civilizations and millions of people. Any African arrivals, whether from deliberate voyages or accidental ocean crossings, would have encountered those existing populations. Mixing would have occurred over generations. Distinct African communities would have gradually blended into broader indigenous populations. This blending process means that looking for a separate, identifiable, pre-Columbian African population in the Americas today is probably the wrong approach. They would not have remained separate. They would have become part of the indigenous populations they encountered, contributing genetic material, cultural practices, and biological ancestry to communities that were then later classified entirely as Native American. Some of what we call indigenous American DNA today may carry ancient African signatures that predate the slave trade by thousands of years. Here is another layer that even fewer people discuss. The very first humans to populate the Americas arrived via the Bering Land Bridge from Asia, approximately 15,000 years ago. But where did those Asian populations ultimately originate? The answer, going back far enough, is Africa. All human beings trace their origins to the African continent. The earliest Homo sapiens were African. The populations that eventually crossed into the Americas were descendants of people who had left Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. In the deepest biological sense, the first Americans were of African descent. This argument is different from saying Black Americans are indigenous. It is saying something more fundamental, that indigeneity itself, traced back far enough, always leads to Africa. This does not give any specific group a legal claim to American land, but it does permanently collapse the idea that African people in American land have no ancient connection. The connection exists. It is written in the evolutionary history of every human being who has ever walked this continent, regardless of what they looked like or what language they spoke. Now, the question that brings the first and second stories together: did the Africans brought to America during the slave trade ever encounter or intermarry with these earlier populations, either the pre-Columbian African descendants absorbed into indigenous tribes or the dark-skinned indigenous people who were being reclassified as Black at the same time enslaved Africans were arriving? The honest answer is almost certainly yes. But documenting specific instances is extremely difficult given how thoroughly colonial record-keeping erased these intersections. The communities where this mixing most likely occurred were the Seminole and Creek nations of Florida and the Southeast. The Maroon communities of the Caribbean and Gulf Coast, where runaway enslaved Africans built independent settlements, and the borderland communities of the Deep South, where racial categories were most fluid and most contested. In these spaces, enslaved Africans, free Africans, dark-skinned indigenous people, and mixed communities lived in proximity, formed alliances, raised families together, and created a layered ancestry that no single racial category can adequately describe. We promised you a straight answer at the beginning of this video. No more questions than answers. No deliberate vagueness. No political hedging. So here it is, broken down exactly the way we set it up at the start. 3 possible answers, and which one applies to you depends entirely on your specific family history. Let us go through each one clearly, honestly, and completely so you can walk away from this video knowing exactly where you stand. If you are asking whether Black Americans are indigenous by primary ancestry, meaning did the majority of Black Americans originate on this continent rather than in Africa? The answer is no. The DNA evidence is clear. 73% sub-Saharan African ancestry in the average Black American genome tells us that the primary origin of most Black Americans is the African continent. That ancestry arrived here by force through one of the most violent and documented human trafficking operations in recorded history. That is not a shame. That is a fact. And denying it does not honor those ancestors. It erases them. If you are asking whether some Black Americans have genuine, verifiable, indigenous ancestry, the answer is yes. Absolutely. And in more ways than most people realize. Some have it through freedmen lineage connected to the 5 civilized tribes, documented on federal rolls that are publicly searchable right now. Some have it through the dark-skinned indigenous communities that were racially reclassified out of native identity by colonial bureaucratic systems. Some have it through the generations of intermarriage between enslaved Africans and native communities across the Southeast. These are real pathways. They are documented. They are not myths. If you are asking whether Black Americans are legally indigenous, meaning do they qualify for tribal enrollment and federal recognition as Native Americans, the answer is it depends, and the bar is high. The only pathway to legal indigeneity that is currently recognized runs through documented ancestry on tribal rolls like the Dawes Rolls, combined with the enrollment policies of whichever specific tribe your ancestor belonged to. Skin color does not qualify you. Family, oral tradition does not qualify you. DNA percentage alone does not qualify you. Documentation qualifies you. If you have it, pursue it. Now, let us address the viral claim directly because you came here with that question and you deserve a direct response to it. The posts that say Black Americans are not African, that the slave trade was a lie invented to steal indigenous land, that Black Americans are the real Native Americans. These claims are not supported by DNA evidence, archaeological evidence, or documented history. They originate largely from Moorish science temple ideology, which has been consistently rejected by mainstream historians, geneticists, and anthropologists. Believing these claims does not reclaim your history. It replaces your actual history with a fiction. But, and this is equally important, the people who hear this question and respond with complete dismissal are also wrong. The history is not simple. Dark-skinned people were on this land and were reclassified as Black. Freedmen with legal tribal citizenship had that citizenship stolen. Pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas has genuine scholarly support. The administrative erasure of indigenous identity from dark-complexioned people is a documented historical phenomenon. Dismissing the entire conversation because some versions of it are exaggerated does not make you accurate. It makes you lazy. Here is the thought we want you to leave with. Being Black American and being connected to this land are not mutually exclusive. Your African ancestry is real and it is primary. But this land is also where your people suffered, built, bled, fought, and survived for 400 years. That itself is a form of belonging that does not require a tribal enrollment card or a DNA percentage to validate. The connection between Black Americans and this land is profound. It is just not always the connection that the viral posts describe. For those of you who want to investigate your specific family history, here is what we recommend. Start with the Dawes Rolls at the National Archives website, archives.gov. Search your family surnames, particularly if your family has roots in Oklahoma or the old Indian Territory. If you find ancestors listed as freedmen of any of the 5 civilized tribes, you have found a documented legal connection. From there, research the current enrollment policies of that specific tribe to understand what recognition, if any, is currently available to you. For those whose family connections run through the dark-skinned reclassified tribes, the Yamasee, certain Seminole communities, Lumbee, Melungeon, and others, the documentation is harder to find, but not impossible. County records, old census documents, church records, and land deeds from the 1800s can sometimes reveal indigenous designations that were later changed. Genealogical researchers who specialize in this specific area exist, and their work has recovered indigenous identity for families who had no idea it was part of their story. The bottom line of this entire video comes down to one honest statement. Most Black Americans are primarily descended from Africans brought here by force. And that African ancestry is something to be deeply proud of, not explained away. A smaller but significant number of Black Americans also carry indigenous ancestry through specific documented historical pathways that we have walked through in detail today. And the history of dark-skinned people on this continent is older, deeper, and more complex than almost anything you were taught in school. All of that is true simultaneously. You are not less connected to this land because your primary ancestors came from Africa. Africa gave the world its first humans, its first civilizations, and ultimately, going back far enough, the first people who ever set foot on American soil. The question was never really whether Black people belong on this land. The question was always whether the systems built to classify and control human beings told the truth about who was here, who arrived, and who got to be called indigenous. And as we have shown today, those systems lied. Frequently, deliberately, and the truth is more powerful than any of those lies ever were.